What would you do if your very presence in a space was questioned not with shouts, but with whispers of doubt and entitlement? For Melissa Carter, a self-made businesswoman, this question became all too real during what should have been an ordinary flight. When Melissa took her first-class seat, a seat she had worked tirelessly to earn, an unexpected conflict arose. A fellow passenger, Eleanor Hastings, insisted Melissa didn't belong, sparking a quiet but powerful confrontation. Melissa was asked to move, to make things easier. But Melissa's refusal to yield ignited a chain of events that would challenge not only her own resilience, but the perspectives of everyone around her. This is a story of subtle battles and rippling consequences, of courage in the face of resistance, and the unexpected kindnesses that can emerge from conflict. As Melissa's journey unfolds from a tense flight to a transformative business trip, she discovers the power of standing firm, not just for herself, but for all those who quietly wonder if they, too, belong. Melissa Carter stepped out of the rideshare into the bustling terminal of Denver International Airport. The chilled morning air brushed against her face, reminding her of how far she had come. Pulling her leather roller bag behind her, she adjusted her navy blue blazer, the fabric pressed and professional, yet tailored to her style. It was the look of a woman who had fought for everything she owned. Melissa was 34, a self-made entrepreneur who had built a small but thriving marketing firm after years of struggling through jobs that undervalued her. Born in Chicago's South Side, she had grown up with little more than hope, ambition, and her mother's steadfast belief in her potential. Her apartment in Denver now overlooked a vibrant cityscape, a view she often gazed at while contemplating the road ahead. This flight was her first-class reward for landing a lucrative client, a seat she had paid for herself, representing years of relentless work. Walking briskly through the terminal, Melissa found the gate for her flight to New York. She handed her boarding pass to the agent, who hesitated just a second too long, his gaze flickering between her and the first-class designation. Melissa smiled politely, used to this subtle question of her belonging. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter," the agent said finally, his voice overly polite as though compensating for his earlier doubt. Melissa thanked him and stepped onto the jet bridge, steadying herself. This was not just another business trip. It was a statement, a declaration of her worth to herself and the world. The first-class cabin greeted her with muted luxury, soft leather seats, ambient lighting, and an air of exclusivity. She found her seat, 1A, by the window. Settling in, she pulled out her worn leather journal, its pages filled with ideas and sketches of campaigns. As she wrote, a stir at the front of the cabin caught her attention. A woman in her 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair and a designer handbag draped over her arm, stepped inside. She moved with an air of entitlement, her gaze scanning the cabin like she owned it. Eleanor Hastings was everything Melissa had come to expect in such spaces. Her posture spoke of inherited privilege, her expression one of faint disapproval. Eleanor's sharp eyes landed on Melissa in seat 1A, her step faltering ever so slightly. The moment passed quickly, but the weight of it lingered. Eleanor continued to her seat in 3B, her movements deliberate and clipped. Moments later, Melissa noticed her speaking to a flight attendant, her voice low but pointed. "Excuse me, ma'am," said a young attendant named Josh, approaching Melissa. His smile was polite but strained, his discomfort evident. "Would you be willing to switch seats? It seems there's been some confusion." Melissa tilted her head slightly, closing her journal with deliberate care. "Confusion?" she repeated, her tone calm. "Yes," Josh hesitated, glancing back toward Eleanor. The passenger in 3B thought she was assigned seat 1A. Melissa understood immediately. Her heart quickened, but her face remained neutral. "I purchased this seat," she said firmly. "I am not moving." Josh faltered, clearly unprepared for this response. "It's just it might make things easier," he said weakly. "Easier for whom?" Melissa asked, her voice still soft but edged with steel. Josh opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Before he could recover, Eleanor appeared in the aisle, her expression tight with irritation. "This is absurd," Eleanor said, addressing Josh but looking directly at Melissa. "I always sit in 1A. Surely she can move to accommodate." Melissa inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "Ma'am, this is my seat," she said, "and I am not moving." The exchange caught the attention of the other passengers. Some glanced over, their curiosity thinly veiled, while others buried their faces in newspapers or phones, unwilling to acknowledge the tension. Melissa felt the familiar weight of being watched, judged, and measured. It was the same feeling she had encountered in boardrooms where her voice was ignored until echoed by a man, in high-end stores where clerks followed her like a shadow, and in hotel lobbies where she was asked if she was lost. Eleanor turned to Josh, her voice sharp. "Are you just going to let this go, unresolved?" "I will speak to the flight supervisor," Josh said quickly, retreating up the aisle. Melissa sat back in her seat, her grip on her journal tightening. She reminded herself of her mother's voice. Always calm, always wise. You belong wherever your feet stand. Do not let anyone make you believe otherwise. The minutes stretched on, and Melissa forced herself to focus on her breathing. She refused to let her frustration show. This was not about her. It was about people like Eleanor who could not fathom sharing space with someone who did not look like them. When Josh returned, it was with the flight supervisor, Karen Mills. Karen's demeanor was professional, her tone soothing as she addressed Melissa. "Ms. Carter," Karen began, "we understand there's been a misunderstanding. Would you consider moving to another seat to help resolve the situation?" Melissa looked directly at Karen, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate your position," she said, "but I will not move. This is my seat." Karen hesitated, glancing at Eleanor, who stood with arms crossed, her face a picture of righteous indignation. "I see," Karen said finally. "Thank you for your patience, Miss Carter." Eleanor's face reddened. "You mean to tell me?" Karen cut her off gently. "Mrs. Hastings, I understand your frustration, but seat assignments are final." Melissa's chest tightened as she watched Eleanor return to 3B, her movements stiff with anger. The cabin slowly returned to its usual quiet, but Melissa could feel the tension radiating from behind her. As the plane began boarding the remaining passengers, Melissa opened her journal again. This was a small victory, but the battle was far from over. She knew Eleanor would not let it rest. Melissa glanced out the window at the runway, the golden morning light spreading across the tarmac. She thought of her mother, who had never flown first class but had always dreamed of better for her daughter. "I belong here," Melissa whispered to herself, a quiet affirmation that felt both defiant and resolute. The plane shuddered slightly as its engines roared to life. Melissa steadied herself, knowing this flight would test more than her patience. This was only the beginning. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane taxied to the runway. Melissa Carter leaned back in her seat, her journal open but untouched. The tension in the air was palpable, like a held breath waiting for release. Behind her, she could feel Eleanor Hastings's simmering indignation, each shift in her seat a silent protest. Melissa tried to focus, but her thoughts churned. How many times had she been asked to make herself smaller, to step aside so someone else could feel comfortable? It wasn't just about this seat. It was about a lifetime of being told, in ways both subtle and overt, that she didn't belong. The sound of rustling paper broke her thoughts. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, offering drinks to passengers. Melissa declined politely, though her throat was dry. She needed clarity, not distraction. As the plane finally lifted into the sky, Eleanor's voice rose again, low but insistent. "I simply don't understand why they couldn't resolve this. I always sit in 1A. It's just common courtesy." Melissa inhaled deeply, her grip tightening on her pen. She wasn't going to respond. Not yet. She had learned long ago that some battles required patience. The flight attendants moved briskly, their practiced smiles masking the unease that lingered in the cabin. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their eyes darting between Melissa and Eleanor. But no one spoke. Melissa caught the gaze of a young woman across the aisle, who quickly looked away. It stung, though she couldn't blame her. Silence was safer. Melissa returned to her journal, writing in careful, deliberate strokes. Words had always been her refuge. In this space, she was free to express her frustrations, her hopes, her determination to rise above the noise. Her pen paused as a memory surfaced, her mother sitting at the kitchen table, hands worn from years of hard work, her voice steady. You'll face moments like this, Melissa. People will try to make you feel small, but you don't have to let them. Her mother's words had been both a warning and a promise. Melissa had carried them through every challenge, every doubt, every triumph. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jostling the cabin and pulling Melissa from her thoughts. A few passengers gasped, clutching their armrests, but the moment passed quickly. Eleanor took the opportunity to press the call button. The chime echoed loudly, drawing the attention of those around her. Josh, the young flight attendant, approached cautiously. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to file a complaint," Eleanor said, her tone clipped. "I don't feel comfortable sitting near someone so difficult." Melissa's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. Her pen moved steadily across the page, a silent act of defiance. Josh glanced at Melissa, then back at Eleanor. "I'm sorry you feel that way, ma'am," he said carefully. "Is there something specific you'd like me to address?" Eleanor folded her arms. "I think it's obvious. This situation could have been avoided if she had simply been reasonable." Melissa finally set her pen down, turning her gaze to Eleanor. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of her conviction. "Mrs. Hastings, if you have something to say to me, I suggest you say it directly." Eleanor blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I wasn't speaking to you, but you were speaking about me," Melissa replied evenly. The cabin fell silent. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now openly turned their heads, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Josh shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we can all try to make the best of the flight," he said weakly, his eyes pleading with Melissa to let it go. Melissa met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I am not the one causing a disturbance," she said. Josh hesitated, then nodded. "Understood," he murmured before retreating toward the galley. Eleanor huffed, her frustration evident. She leaned toward her seatmate, muttering something Melissa couldn't hear. Melissa turned back to her journal, but the moment lingered. She could feel the unspoken tension, the silent judgments of those around her. She had grown used to this being the subject of scrutiny, the target of whispers. But today was different. Today, she wasn't going to shrink. The plane leveled out, and the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Melissa closed her journal, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of sky. She found a strange comfort in the vastness, the reminder that the world was so much bigger than this moment. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Excuse me." Melissa turned to see the young woman across the aisle, her expression hesitant but kind. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think you're handling this really well." Melissa blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said softly. The woman nodded, her cheeks coloring slightly. "People like her, they just don't get it. But you're doing the right thing." Melissa smiled faintly, the tension in her chest easing just a bit. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. As the flight continued, Melissa felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was small, a quiet acknowledgement from some of the passengers, a shared understanding that something important was happening. Eleanor remained silent, her indignation simmering but unspoken. Melissa suspected she was waiting for another opportunity to assert herself, but for now, the battle had paused. Melissa leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. She thought of her mother again, of the sacrifices she had made, the lessons she had taught. "You belong," her mother had said. "No one can take that from you." The words echoed in Melissa's mind, a steady anchor in the midst of the storm. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks, his demeanor more subdued than before. He stopped at Melissa's seat, his smile tentative. "Would you like something, Miss Carter?" Melissa considered for a moment, then shook her head. "No, thank you." The attendant hesitated, then nodded and moved on. Melissa picked up her journal again, the weight of the pen familiar and grounding in her hand. She began to write, the words flowing more freely now. This was not the first challenge she had faced, nor would it be the last. But she was still here, still standing, or in this case, still seated. The cabin around her grew quieter, the whispers fading into the hum of the engines. Melissa's resolve solidified. She would not be moved, not today, not ever. The hours seemed to stretch as the plane cruised high above the clouds. Melissa Carter's hand moved across her journal's pages, but her focus was elsewhere. She could still feel Eleanor Hastings's presence behind her, a constant source of tension, like a storm cloud on the horizon. Melissa forced herself to take a deep breath. She had already decided she wouldn't let this moment define her flight, much less her day. Yet the weight of the unspoken battle hung in the air, undeniable and oppressive. The cabin was unusually quiet. The whispers from earlier had faded, replaced by the soft rustle of newspapers and the occasional clink of glasses. But Melissa knew that the silence was deceptive. The other passengers might not be speaking, but they were watching, absorbing every moment as though it were a show created for their entertainment. A faint ding from the call button broke the stillness, and Melissa tensed instinctively. Sure enough, it was Eleanor again. Josh appeared from the galley, his steps slower this time, as though he were dragging the weight of the situation with him. "Yes, ma'am," he asked, keeping his voice as even as he could manage. "I need to register my dissatisfaction," Eleanor began, her tone icy but measured. "I've been treated poorly, and frankly, this entire situation has been handled inappropriately." Josh shifted uncomfortably. "I apologize for any inconvenience, ma'am. Is there something specific you'd like me to address?" Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Melissa for the briefest of moments before she straightened in her seat. "I don't feel safe. I think the airline needs to reconsider how it assigns seating to ensure a more harmonious experience for everyone." Melissa's grip tightened on her pen. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. Eleanor's words were a deliberate escalation, an attempt to shift the narrative. Josh nodded mechanically, though his discomfort was evident. "I'll pass along your concerns to the flight supervisor." As Josh walked away, Eleanor muttered something under her breath, loud enough for Melissa to hear, but too quiet to catch the full meaning. Melissa closed her journal slowly, carefully. She had learned long ago that confrontation required preparation. She turned slightly in her seat, just enough to meet Eleanor's gaze. "Mrs. Hastings," Melissa said, her voice low but firm. "If you feel unsafe, perhaps you should reflect on why that is." Eleanor stiffened, her expression a mix of indignation and surprise. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Melissa replied. Her tone remained calm, but her words carried an edge. "What exactly about me makes you feel unsafe? Is it the fact that I refuse to move, or is it something deeper than that?" The cabin fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but faltered, her face flushing with color. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said finally, her voice shaking with restrained anger. "No, you don't," Melissa agreed, her gaze steady. "But your actions speak for themselves." Karen Mills, the flight supervisor, returned then, her steps hurried and deliberate. She approached Melissa's seat first, her expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Carter," Karen began, her tone diplomatic. "I wanted to check in and ensure everything is all right on your end." Melissa raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "It is. However, it seems Mrs. Hastings is still experiencing discomfort." Karen blinked, caught off guard by the directness. "Yes, well," she glanced over at Eleanor, who sat with her arms crossed, her jaw set. "We're doing our best to address her concerns." Melissa tilted her head slightly. "And what about mine?" Karen hesitated. "We want to make sure all passengers feel comfortable." "Comfortable?" Melissa repeated. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Comfort often comes at someone else's expense. Tell me, Ms. Mills, whose comfort are you prioritizing here?" Karen's composure faltered, if only for a moment. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a new voice. "This is ridiculous," a man's voice declared loudly. Melissa recognized him from earlier, an older gentleman seated in 2B, his silver hair neatly combed and his suit impeccably pressed. "Why don't we just fix this and move on?" he continued, his irritation barely contained. "Some of us would like a peaceful flight." Melissa turned her attention to him, her expression unreadable. "Peaceful for whom, sir?" The man blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. I didn't mean anything by it. I just think this whole thing is unnecessary. Unnecessary for you, Melissa said evenly. Because you're not the one being asked to move. You're not the one being scrutinized for sitting in a seat you paid for. The man's face flushed, and he quickly looked away. Karen cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. Perhaps we can all agree to move forward and enjoy the remainder of the flight, she said, her voice strained but polite. Melissa smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Moving forward requires accountability, Ms. Mills. Ignoring the issue doesn't make it go away. Karen said nothing, her gaze shifting awkwardly between Melissa and Eleanor. The silence stretched uncomfortable and heavy. Melissa picked up her journal again, opening it to a blank page. She began to write, her movements slow and deliberate, as though to reclaim the space that had been stolen from her. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tense but subdued. The passengers who had been watching the exchange now avoided eye contact, their discomfort evident. But Melissa noticed something else, a subtle shift in the energy around her. A young woman across the aisle gave her a small, encouraging nod. Josh, the flight attendant, lingered briefly by her seat, his expression apologetic. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Melissa that she wasn't entirely alone. Later, as the plane began its descent, Karen returned once more. She approached Melissa with a more subdued demeanor, her voice quieter this time. "Miss Carter," she said hesitantly, "I want to thank you for your patience during this flight." Melissa closed her journal and met Karen's gaze. "I'm not patient," she said softly. "I'm resolute." Karen nodded slowly, the words sinking in. "Understood," she said before stepping away. Melissa watched her retreat, then glanced out the window at the darkening sky. The lights of New York City sparkled in the distance, a reminder of the opportunities waiting below. She had drawn her line, and though the battle wasn't over, she felt a quiet sense of victory. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the first-class cabin thickened. The initial confrontation had passed, but the air remained heavy, charged with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Melissa Carter could feel it pressing down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She stared out the window, the lights of New York City coming into view as streaks of gold against the encroaching twilight. She had been to this city many times before, and each visit reminded her of the grit and determination it took to carve out space for herself in a world that seemed determined to overlook her. Behind her, Eleanor Hastings's presence loomed, even in silence. Melissa could sense the other passengers' discomfort, their nervous glances darting between her and Eleanor whenever they thought no one was looking. But none of them spoke up. Melissa sighed quietly, turning back to her journal. Words had always been her anchor, her way of processing the complexities of a world that often felt unkind. "Some storms pass quickly," she wrote. "Others linger, reshaping the landscape before they finally dissipate. The question is, how do you weather them?" The flight attendant, Josh, reappeared, his expression more cautious than before. He moved down the aisle, offering drinks, his attempts at maintaining professionalism faltering under the weight of the situation. When he reached Melissa, he hesitated. "Would you care for anything, Miss Carter?" he asked softly. Melissa looked up, her gaze steady. "No, thank you," she replied. Josh nodded quickly and moved on, his shoulders visibly tense. As he passed Eleanor's row, Melissa caught the faint murmur of Eleanor's voice. Though the words were muffled, the tone was unmistakable, sharp, and laced with indignation. "She's making everyone uncomfortable," Eleanor whispered to her seatmate, who nodded weakly but said nothing in return. "This is what happens when people like her think they can just take whatever they want." Melissa closed her journal with deliberate care, her heartbeat quickening. She turned in her seat, her expression calm but firm as she addressed Eleanor directly. "Mrs. Hastings," she began, her voice low but steady, "if you have something to say, I suggest you say it to me." Eleanor flinched, caught off guard by Melissa's directness, but she quickly recovered, her composure hardening. "I wasn't speaking to you," she said coldly. "No," Melissa replied, "but you were speaking about me." The cabin grew still, the faint hum of the engines the only sound. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their attention now fully drawn to the confrontation they had tried so hard to ignore. Eleanor's lips tightened. "I don't see why you're making this into such a big deal," she said, her voice brittle. Melissa leaned slightly forward, her tone measured but unyielding. "Big deal," she repeated. "This is about more than a seat, and you know it." Eleanor's cheeks flushed with color, but she held her ground. "You're twisting my words." "I don't need to twist anything," Melissa said evenly. "Your words speak for themselves." Karen Mills, the flight supervisor, appeared again, her steps purposeful, but her expression strained. She stepped between the two women, her voice carefully neutral. "Ladies," she began, "please, let's focus on having a peaceful flight." Melissa turned to Karen, her gaze sharp. "Ms. Mills, I think the question you should be asking is why Mrs. Hastings feels comfortable speaking about me in this way." Karen hesitated, clearly unprepared for the challenge. She glanced at Eleanor, whose expression was a mixture of anger and discomfort. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding," Karen stammered. Melissa shook her head slowly. "There's no misunderstanding. This is about entitlement and the belief that some people belong in certain spaces while others don't. Isn't that right, Mrs. Hastings?" Eleanor's face reddened further, but she said nothing. The older man in 2B, who had earlier expressed irritation at the delay, decided to speak again. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why can't we all just be civil and move on?" Melissa turned her attention to him, her expression calm but unyielding. "Civility," she said softly, "is often used as a weapon to silence those who speak the truth. Tell me, sir, what exactly about this situation do you find so disruptive?" The man faltered, his gaze shifting to the in-flight magazine in his lap. "I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled. Melissa nodded slowly. "That's the problem," she said. "You don't mean anything, but your silence and complicity allow situations like this to continue." The man said nothing more, his face reddening as he sank deeper into his seat. Karen cleared her throat, attempting to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Miss Carter, if there's anything we can do to ensure your comfort." Melissa held up a hand, stopping her. "What you can do, Ms. Mills, is stop asking me to fix what I didn't break. Address the real issue instead of deflecting it onto me." Karen hesitated, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "I'll speak to the captain," she said finally before retreating toward the galley. Melissa leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. She wasn't angry, not in the way Eleanor likely thought she was. She was tired of always having to defend her right to exist in spaces she had earned. The plane began its descent into New York, the city's lights glowing brighter with each passing moment. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense but subdued. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing the passengers for landing, Melissa noticed the young woman across the aisle watching her again. This time, their eyes met, and the woman offered a small, hesitant smile. Melissa returned the gesture, feeling a flicker of warmth despite everything. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that kindness still existed, even in moments of conflict. When the plane finally landed and the passengers began disembarking, Melissa gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate. She felt the weight of Eleanor's gaze as she walked down the aisle, but she didn't look back. As she stepped into the terminal, the bright lights and bustling energy of New York enveloped her. She paused for a moment, taking in the familiar rhythm of the city. She hadn't just held her ground today, she had drawn a line, one she refused to let anyone cross. And as she walked toward the baggage claim, she felt a quiet but undeniable sense of resolve. She belonged, and no one could take that from her. Melissa Carter walked through the bustling terminal of JFK Airport, the echoes of the flight still fresh in her mind. Though she kept her head high and her shoulders squared, the weight of the confrontation lingered, pressing against her like an invisible barrier. She moved purposefully, weaving through the sea of travelers. But inwardly, she replayed every moment the sharpness of Eleanor's words, the discomfort etched on Karen Mills's face, and the quiet nod of solidarity from the young woman across the aisle. The noise of the terminal was a welcome distraction. Announcements blared overhead, Suitcases rattled along tiled floors, and conversations blended into a background hum. Melissa exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the rhythm of the world outside the cabin. She had weathered worse storms before, but this one felt personal. Melissa stepped outside into the cool evening air, where a car service awaited. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a stark reminder of why she had come here. This trip wasn't about Eleanor Hastings or anyone else on that flight. It was about securing the future of her business, her dream that had taken years to build from scratch. As the car pulled away from the airport, Melissa allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought of her mother, whose quiet resilience had shaped her own. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You carry your belonging with you, Melissa. Never let anyone take that from you." The words had always been a source of strength, but they felt heavier now, as if the world was testing her resolve yet again. The car arrived at the boutique hotel Melissa had booked for her stay. She checked in smoothly, the staff warm and professional, and was soon settling into her room. The minimalist decor, with its clean lines and soft lighting, offered a momentary reprieve. She unpacked her essentials, setting her leather journal on the desk by the window. Melissa sank into the chair, staring out at the city below. She had a meeting with a potential client in the morning, a major opportunity that could take her business to the next level. But her mind kept drifting back to the flight. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Janet, her closest friend and confidant. "Janet, made it to New York?" Melissa smiled faintly and replied. "Melissa, yes, just checked in." The response came quickly. "Janet, and the flight? How did it go?" Melissa hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. She didn't want to burden Janet, who had her own challenges to deal with. But the need to share was too strong. "Melissa, it was eventful. Let's just say I had to remind someone that I belonged in 1A. Janet's reply was immediate. "Janet, I hope you reminded them loud and clear. You've earned your place, Melissa. Don't let anyone forget it." Melissa smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. Janet always had a way of lifting her spirits. The next morning, Melissa rose early, her determination renewed. She dressed in a tailored black pantsuit, her confidence reflected in every detail from her polished shoes to the silver bracelet that had been her mother's. As she left the hotel and stepped into the waiting car, she reminded herself of her purpose. Her meeting was in Midtown, in a sleek skyscraper that housed one of the country's largest tech firms. The potential client, Jonathan Adler, was a high-ranking executive known for his sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach. Securing his account would be a game-changer for Melissa's firm. She arrived at the office building and was greeted by a cheerful receptionist who escorted her to a modern conference room. Melissa took a seat at the long glass table, her leather portfolio in hand, and waited. Jonathan Adler entered the room a few minutes later, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He extended a hand, his grip firm. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice warm but professional. "Thank you for coming. I've heard good things about your work." "Thank you, Mr. Adler," Melissa replied, meeting his gaze with confidence. "I'm excited to discuss how we can help your team reach new heights." The meeting began smoothly. Melissa presented her ideas with clarity and precision, weaving her passion for marketing into every detail. Adler listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that Melissa answered with ease. But as the meeting progressed, Melissa noticed something unexpected, a shift in Adler's demeanor. He leaned forward, his tone softening as he spoke. "You know," he said, "I admire what you've built. It's not easy carving out space in an industry like ours." Melissa tilted her head slightly. "It's been a journey, to say the least," she replied carefully. Adler nodded, his expression thoughtful. "My mother always said the same thing. She started her own business when very few women were doing so. Hearing your story reminds me of her." The words caught Melissa off guard. She had prepared for questions about metrics and deliverables, not a personal connection. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." By the time the meeting ended, Melissa felt a cautious sense of optimism. Adler had expressed genuine interest in her firm's services, and she knew she had made a strong impression. As she left the building, the cool breeze of the city wrapped around her like an embrace. Back at the hotel, Melissa allowed herself a moment to breathe. She sat by the window, her journal open, and reflected on the day. The weight of the flight still lingered, but it no longer felt as heavy. The meeting had reminded her of why she endured moments like those with Eleanor, because every battle was a step towards something greater. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from her email. Opening it, she found a message from Jonathan Adler's assistant. Subject: follow-up and next steps. Melissa's heart skipped a beat as she read the email. Adler wanted to move forward with her firm, offering a contract that exceeded her expectations. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen, the enormity of the opportunity sinking in. Then, a smile spread across her face, one born of both relief and triumph. That evening, Melissa treated herself to dinner at a small, family-owned restaurant near her hotel. As she sipped her wine, she thought again of her mother's words. "You carry your belonging with you," Melissa whispered, a quiet affirmation that felt truer than ever. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more Eleanor Hastingses waiting to test her resolve. But she also knew she had the strength to face them. Because belonging wasn't about a seat or a space, it was about claiming her worth and refusing to let it be diminished. The quiet triumph of Melissa's day lingered as she returned to her hotel that evening. The contract from Jonathan Adler was more than just a business opportunity, it was validation, a tangible reward for years of hard work and perseverance. Yet, even as she reveled in the victory, the echoes of the flight persisted in her mind. Melissa sat by the large window in her hotel room, the city's twinkling lights sprawling beneath her. She opened her journal, her pen poised over the blank page, but no words came. Instead, her thoughts drifted to Eleanor Hastings, her cold stare, and the quiet venom in her words. Why do they still get to you? Melissa thought to herself. She had faced countless challenges before, far harsher words and bigger battles. But there was something about the subtle cruelty of Eleanor's indignation that lingered like a splinter. It wasn't the volume of the offense, but its persistence, like a whisper that refused to fade. The next morning, Melissa woke early, her determination renewed. She dressed sharply in cream blouse and gray slacks, her usual armor for days when the stakes felt high. Today was the first of several meetings to finalize her contract with Adler's team. She knew there would be questions, negotiations, and possibly pushback. But Melissa was ready. As she stepped into the bustling Midtown office building, a familiar voice called out, "Melissa?" Turning, Melissa saw Claire Porter, an old college friend. Claire's face lit up with a smile as she hurried over, her sleek pantsuit and confident stride reflecting her role as a rising executive in a prominent firm. "Claire," Melissa said, genuinely surprised but pleased. They embraced briefly, years melting away as memories of shared dorm rooms and late-night study sessions resurfaced. "I had no idea you were in New York," Claire said. "What brings you here?" Melissa explained her business and the potential partnership with Adler's firm. Claire's expression brightened further. "That's amazing," Claire said. "You've always been a powerhouse. Adler's lucky to have you." Melissa smiled, the warmth of Claire's words settling over her like a balm. "It's been a journey," she admitted. Claire tilted her head, studying her friend. "You're always so modest," she said. "But you're doing it, Melissa. You're making your mark." The two women parted ways, but Claire's words stayed with Melissa as she entered Adler's office. The meeting was productive, filled with lively discussion and collaboration. Adler's team respected her expertise, and she felt her confidence growing with each passing moment. By the time she left the building, the city's golden afternoon light had softened the sharp edges of its towering skyline. Melissa decided to take a walk, needing time to process the whirlwind of emotions. She found herself in Bryant Park, the green space bustling with activity. Families picnicked, joggers passed by, and street performers entertained small crowds. Melissa settled on a bench near a fountain, letting the lively atmosphere wash over her. As she sat, a woman approached her, hesitating before speaking. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. Melissa looked up and saw a familiar face. It was the young woman from the plane, the one who had offered her a quiet nod of support during the confrontation with Eleanor. "Hi," the woman said, smiling nervously. I hope you don't mind me stopping you. I recognized you from the flight. Melissa blinked, surprised but not unpleasantly so. Not at all, she said, gesturing for the woman to sit. The woman introduced herself as Rachel, a graphic designer visiting New York for a conference. She explained how she had been deeply moved by Melissa's calm, yet firm stance during the conflict on the plane. I've been in situations like that before, Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly, where someone made me feel like I didn't belong. But I've never had the courage to speak up the way you did. Melissa's chest tightened. It's not always easy, she admitted. But sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. Rachel nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. You gave me hope, she said. Watching you reminded me that it's okay to take up space, to exist unapologetically. For the first time since the flight, Melissa felt the lingering weight of Eleanor's words begin to lift. The two women talked for a while longer, sharing stories of challenges and triumphs. By the time Rachel left, Melissa felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about her own battles, it was about the ripple effect of standing firm, the way her actions could inspire others to find their own strength. As Melissa walked back to her hotel, the city seemed brighter, the air lighter. She thought of her mother's words once more. You carry your belonging with you. But now, Melissa realized, it wasn't just about carrying her own belonging. It was about helping others find theirs. Later that evening, Melissa sat in her hotel room, her journal open before her. She began to write, the pen moving easily across the page. Kindness is a quiet force. It doesn't shout or demand attention, but it lingers, steady and unshakable. When faced with resistance, it can feel fragile, but it is anything but. Kindness is strength, the kind that inspires, the kind that endures. She paused, the words settling into place, then wrote one more line. And in the face of whispers, kindness can roar. Melissa closed her journal and looked out at the city again, its lights stretching endlessly into the horizon. The challenges weren't over. There would be more Eleanor Hastingses, more moments of doubt. But there would also be people like Rachel, Claire, and Adler, people whose kindness and belief would help her weather the storms. And as long as she carried her belonging with her, Melissa knew she could face whatever came next. The following morning, Melissa Carter woke to sunlight streaming through the hotel window, casting warm streaks across her room. The city buzzed faintly below, its rhythm a reminder of the fast-paced world she had stepped into. As she sipped her morning coffee, she reviewed the notes she had prepared for another meeting with Jonathan Adler's team. The excitement of securing the contract still lingered, but Melissa knew the real work was just beginning. She glanced at her journal, its leather cover sitting closed on the desk. Last night's reflections about kindness and resilience felt distant now, replaced by the practicalities of running her business. Yet, as she closed her eyes for a moment, Rachel's words from the day before resurfaced. You gave me hope. Melissa inhaled deeply. She hadn't thought of herself as an inspiration, but perhaps she could carry that quiet strength into the next chapter of her journey. The meeting with Adler's team was another success. They outlined a collaborative timeline, shared resources, and set the groundwork for a partnership that would position Melissa's firm on a larger stage. Afterward, Adler pulled her aside as the team dispersed. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice warm but direct, I want you to know that I respect the way you conduct yourself. You're sharp, prepared, and professional, everything we look for in a partner. Melissa smiled. Thank you, Mr. Adler. That means a lot. Adler paused, his expression shifting slightly. It's not just your business acumen, he continued. You carry yourself with grace, even when others might test your resolve. That's a rare quality. Melissa blinked, unsure how to respond. Was he referring to something specific, or was this simply a general observation? Either way, his words struck a chord. You've built something extraordinary, Adler added, extending a hand. I'm glad we're working together. Melissa shook his hand firmly, gratitude and determination swelling within her. That afternoon, Melissa decided to visit the New York Public Library, a place she had always admired but never had the time to explore during previous trips. The grand architecture and quiet halls felt like a sanctuary, a world apart from the bustling city streets. She wandered through the rows of books, letting her thoughts settle. The library's stillness reminded her of the moments on the plane, when silence had felt heavy with judgment. Here, though, silence was a comfort, an invitation to reflect without the weight of expectations. Melissa sat at a long wooden table, her journal opens in front of her. She began to jot down ideas for Adler's campaign, but her mind soon drifted. She thought of Rachel again, of Claire, and of Adler's unexpected kindness. Each of these moments, small on their own, had begun to form a pattern, a reminder that even in the face of resistance, there were connections to be made, allies to be found. Melissa's musings were interrupted when she noticed a young man seated a few tables away, glancing at her hesitantly. He looked to be in his early 20s, dressed casually but neatly, with a laptop open in front of him. After a moment, he stood and approached her, clutching a notebook in his hands. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tentative but polite. "I don't mean to bother you, but are you Melissa Carter?" Melissa's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Yes, I am. How do you know me?" "I was on your flight a few days ago," he said quickly. "I was in coach, but I saw what happened." Melissa felt a flicker of tension return, but masked it with a calm smile. "I see. And what did you see?" The young man hesitated, then spoke with more confidence. "I saw someone standing up for herself, with dignity and strength. It meant a lot to me." Melissa tilted her head, curiosity replacing her initial wariness. "Why is that?" He exhaled, as though gathering his thoughts. "I'm a first-generation college student," he began. "My family immigrated here when I was little, and we've worked so hard just to survive. I've always felt out of place in spaces like this, like I'm borrowing time that doesn't belong to me. Watching you on that flight, it made me realize I'm allowed to be here too." Melissa felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this encounter, much less the depth of his words. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you know." The young man nodded, his expression earnest. "I just wanted to say that before I left. Thank you for being an example." Melissa watched him return to his seat, a quiet pride settling over her. This was the second time someone had approached her with such words, and it left her both humbled and emboldened. As she left the library, the city seemed to hum with possibility. Melissa stopped at a small cafe, ordering a cup of tea and sitting by the window to watch the world go by. She thought again of the young man's words, how they echoed Rachel's sentiment from the day before. There was a unity in their stories, a shared understanding of what it meant to navigate spaces where belonging often felt conditional. Melissa reached for her journal, her pen moving swiftly across the page. In a world that whispers, "You don't belong," even the smallest acts of courage can inspire others to whisper back, "Yes, you do." She paused, letting the thought settle, then wrote. And maybe, together, those whispers can grow into something louder, something unshakable. Melissa smiled faintly, her resolve strengthening with each word. The Eleanor Hastingses of the world would always exist, but so would the Rachels and the young men in libraries. And as long as people like them stood together, there was hope for change. That evening, Melissa received a call from Claire, her old college friend. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Claire began, "about your business and the challenges you've faced. It's inspiring, Melissa. I want to help." Melissa was taken aback. "Help how?" "My company is always looking for marketing partners," Claire explained. "Why don't we set up a meeting next week? I'd love to see if we can work together." Melissa felt a rush of gratitude. "Claire, that means so much." "Thank you." "No need to thank me," Claire said warmly. "You've earned every opportunity that comes your way." As the call ended, Melissa sat in quiet reflection. The pieces of her journey were coming together in ways she hadn't anticipated. One act of resistance on a plane had sparked ripples she could never have foreseen. And as she prepared for another day, Melissa knew this was only the beginning. Melissa Carter's schedule over the next few days was packed with meetings and follow-ups. Yet her mind often returned to the small but profound moments of connection she had experienced since her flight. Rachel's gratitude, the young man's earnestness at the library, and Claire's unexpected offer were reminders that the ripples of her actions extended further than she could have imagined. It wasn't just about her battles anymore. It was about the change she could inspire in others by standing firm. Each new encounter strengthened her resolve, reminding her why it was essential to hold her ground, even when it felt exhausting. Her last full day in New York began with a breakfast meeting at a cozy diner in Chelsea. Claire had introduced her to Linda Strauss, a corporate connections specialist whose vast network could potentially open new doors for Melissa's business. Linda was sharp and intuitive, listening intently as Melissa spoke about her journey and her vision for the future of her firm. The conversation flowed easily, but midway through their meal, Linda leaned in, her tone turning serious. "You know," Linda began, "what you're building is incredible, and it's clear you've earned your success. But I've been in rooms where people like you were dismissed before you even open your mouth." Melissa felt her shoulders tighten instinctively, though Linda's words carried no malice, only a directness that came from experience. "I don't say that to discourage you," Linda continued. "I say it because I've seen what happens when women like us push back. When we remind them we deserve to be there. It changes things, Melissa. Not just for you, but for the people watching who need that example." Melissa nodded slowly, Linda's words settling over her like a challenge. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I've been learning that more and more recently." Linda smiled. "Good. Because the world needs more people like you doing exactly what you're doing." As the day went on, Melissa attended another round of meetings, feeling the momentum of her efforts beginning to take shape. Contracts were signed, and a new client expressed interest in a long-term partnership. She felt the pieces of her professional life clicking into place, each success a validation of the risks she had taken to get here. But amid the flurry of achievements, Melissa found herself yearning for a moment of quiet reflection. She decided to spend her last evening in the city at a small jazz club she had visited years ago during one of her first business trips. The dimly lit venue was tucked away on a side street, its unassuming exterior giving way to a cozy interior filled with the hum of conversation and the soulful sounds of a live band. Melissa took a seat near the back, ordering a glass of wine and letting the music wash over her. As the night wore on, Melissa felt a presence nearby. Glancing up, she saw a man in his 50s standing by her table. He had a warm smile and an air of quiet confidence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but kind. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you Melissa Carter?" Melissa straightened, caught off guard. "Yes, I am," she replied. "How do you know me?" "I was on your flight a few days ago," the man said, taking a step closer. "I didn't say anything then, but I've been thinking about what happened. Watching you hold your ground, it left an impression." Melissa gestured for him to sit, curiosity mingling with caution. "I appreciate that," she said as he settled across from her. "May I ask why it stayed with you?" The man hesitated, his expression growing thoughtful. "I've spent my life in corporate America," he explained. "I've seen people like Mrs. Hastings more times than I can count, people who believe they own every space they walk into. And I've seen far too many people give in to them, just to keep the peace. But you didn't." Melissa studied him, her guard softening as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about my own silence," he admitted. "I could have said something on that flight, but I didn't. And I regret that." Melissa shook her head gently. "It's not easy to speak up in those moments," she said. "But acknowledging it now, that matters too." The man nodded, his gaze steady. "You've reminded me that silence has consequences, and I don't want to be silent anymore." They spoke for a while longer, the conversation flowing naturally. The man introduced himself as Bill Harper, a senior executive at a consulting firm. By the end of the night, he handed Melissa his business card. "If you ever need an ally in the industry," Bill said, "I'd be honored to help." Melissa took the card, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Bill. That means a lot." As he left, Melissa sat back, her mind racing with the unexpected connection. The ripples of that flight continued to expand, reaching people she hadn't even realized were watching. The next morning, Melissa packed her bags and checked out of the hotel, ready to return to Denver. As she arrived at the airport and made her way through security, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had happened since her arrival. Her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Claire, safe travels. Let's finalize that meeting. Soon I'm excited to see what we can build together." Melissa smiled, replying quickly before heading to her gate. When she boarded her return flight, Melissa felt a mix of relief and anticipation. She had accomplished so much in just a few days, but she knew this was only the beginning. As she settled into her seat once again in 1A, Melissa opened her journal, her pen moving easily across the page. Sometimes resistance is quiet, a refusal to yield when others demand it. Sometimes it's loud, a challenge that cannot be ignored. But always it matters. Because resistance isn't just for you, it's for everyone who needs to see that change is possible. She paused, letting the thought linger, then added, "And when the world whispers, you don't belong, let your presence be the answer." Melissa closed her journal as the plane began its ascent, the hum of the engines steadying her thoughts. She stared out the window at the clouds below, a quiet smile on her face. The journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The flight home felt calmer than the one that had brought Melissa Carter to New York. The cabin hummed with quiet conversation, the faint rustle of newspapers, and the steady drone of the engines. Sitting in seat 1A again, Melissa felt a sense of closure, as though she had reclaimed something intangible. Her journal rested open on her lap, but her pen remained still. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly, their soft forms painted in hues of gold and silver by the sun. The view reminded her of the expansiveness of the world, a perspective she often lost in the heat of her battles. This flight carried none of the hostility of her first encounter with Eleanor Hastings, yet Melissa could still feel the lingering weight of that confrontation. It wasn't Eleanor herself who stayed with her, but what she represented: a system, a mindset, a whisper that had followed Melissa her entire life. "You don't belong." But Melissa had countered that whisper with her presence, her quiet refusal to yield. And, in doing so, she had discovered something powerful. Her actions didn't just affect her. They echoed. When the plane touched down in Denver, Melissa felt a renewed sense of purpose. She gathered her belongings, her journal tucked carefully into her bag, and exited the plane with steady steps. The terminal was bright and bustling, a world of motion and sound. Melissa made her way to the baggage claim, her mind already turning to the tasks ahead. Her schedule for the coming weeks was packed with follow-up calls, campaign planning, and the first steps of implementing her new partnership with Jonathan Adler's team. As she waited for her luggage, her phone buzzed with an incoming email. Glancing at the screen, she saw it was from Adler himself. Subject: excited about what's ahead. Melissa opened the email and scanned the brief but enthusiastic message. Adler thanked her for her insights during their meetings and emphasized his confidence in the partnership. Melissa smiled, feeling a swell of pride. This was more than a business when it was a testament to her perseverance. As she stepped outside into the crisp Denver air, Melissa spotted a familiar figure waiting for her: Janet, her best friend and confidant. Janet waved enthusiastically, her bright smile a welcome sight after the whirlwind of the past few days. "Welcome back, world traveler," Janet called as Melissa approached. Melissa laughed, embracing her friend. "It's good to be home." Janet took Melissa's bag, leading her toward the car. "You have to tell me everything," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "How did it go? Did Adler sign on?" Melissa nodded. "He did, and it's even better than I expected. But that's not all." As they drove, Melissa recounted the highlights of her trip: the meeting with Adler, Claire's unexpected offer, and the chance encounters that had left her feeling both humbled and inspired. Janet listened intently, her expressions shifting from delight to admiration to quiet thoughtfulness. "Melissa," Janet said as they pulled into her driveway, "do you realize how much you've accomplished? And not just with Adler. You've built something that's inspiring people. That's huge." Melissa smiled, though a trace of doubt flickered in her mind. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough," she admitted. "There's still so much work to do." Janet turned to her, her gaze steady. "It's not about doing everything at once. It's about the impact you make along the way. And trust me, you're making an impact." Later that evening, Melissa sat on her apartment's balcony, the city lights twinkling below her. The air was cool, and a light breeze carried the faint scent of pine. Her journal lay open on the small table beside her, its pages filled with thoughts from the past week. She reflected on Janet's words, letting them settle. The doubts she carried weren't new, they were part of the journey. But as she thought about the people who had reached out to her, the small moments of connection that had unfolded, she realized Janet was right. Her impact wasn't in single, sweeping victories. It was in the quiet ripples her actions created, the way her presence inspired others to find their own strength. Melissa picked up her pen and began to write. The truth is, belonging isn't something the world can give you. It's something you carry within yourself. And when you hold it with pride, it becomes unshakable. It inspires others to do the same, until the whisper of resistance grows into a chorus. She paused, her pen hovering above the page. Then she added, "Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones you don't even realize you've won." The next morning, Melissa arrived at her office early, eager to dive into her work. Her team greeted her warmly, their enthusiasm reminding her of why she had started this business in the first place. Together, they reviewed the Adler contract, laying the groundwork for what would become one of their most ambitious projects yet. As the day progressed, Melissa found herself pausing occasionally to reflect. The challenges she faced on the plane, in business, in life were not unique to her. They were shared by so many others, people who fought battles large and small every day just to claim their space. And though Melissa knew she couldn't change the world overnight, she felt a deep sense of responsibility to keep fighting not just for herself, but for all those who needed to see that change was possible. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Melissa returned to her balcony. She sipped a cup of tea, watching the sky fade from gold to deep indigo. Her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Claire, looking forward to our meeting next week. Let's build something amazing." Melissa smiled, her resolve strengthening with each passing moment. She belonged, and now she carried the certainty that her belonging could create space for others to stand tall as well. The whispers that had once tried to diminish her voice now fueled her determination. And as the city lights flickered into the night, Melissa knew she was just getting started. Melissa Carter rose with the first light of dawn, the faint orange glow filtering through her curtains. She stretched, letting the quiet of the morning settle her thoughts. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her business, but for herself. As she prepared for the day, her mind lingered on everything that had brought her to this moment. The confrontations, the connections, the unexpected kindnesses, they had all left an imprint on her. The challenges she faced on the flight seemed distant now, but their lessons were vivid. The whispers that had once questioned her belonging no longer held the same weight. She had heard them, acknowledged them, and chosen to rise above. Now, her focus was clear. Melissa arrived at her office early, the sun just beginning to crest over the Denver skyline. Her team was abuzz with energy, their excitement for the Adler campaign palpable. "Morning, boss," greeted Sam, her operations manager, as she walked in. "We got a full day ahead." Melissa smiled. "Good. Let's get to it." The hours passed in a whirlwind of meetings, brainstorming sessions, and planning. Melissa thrived in the chaos, her leadership steady and decisive. She saw her team's confidence growing with each decision, their faith in her vision propelling them forward. By midday, they had finalized a comprehensive strategy for Adler's campaign. As her team dispersed for a well-earned break, Melissa lingered in the conference room, letting the sense of accomplishment wash over her. The afternoon brought another milestone, her first meeting with Claire's company. The two women had spent the past week exchanging ideas, and now it was time to solidify their collaboration. Claire greeted Melissa warmly as she arrived at the sleek downtown office. "I've been looking forward to this," Claire said, leading Melissa to a sunlit conference room. The discussion flowed easily, their shared history adding a layer of trust to the professional rapport. Claire's team was impressed with Melissa's insights, and by the end of the meeting, they had laid the foundation for a promising partnership. As they walked to the elevator together, Claire turned to Melissa. "You know," Claire began, "watching you today, I couldn't help but think about college. You've always had this drive, but seeing where it's taken you, I'm in awe, Melissa." Melissa chuckled softly. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Claire nodded. You're not just breaking barriers, you're showing others how to do it too. That's powerful. Melissa felt a swell of gratitude. Claire's words were a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. That evening, Melissa returned to her apartment, the Denver skyline glowing softly against the night sky. She made herself a cup of tea and stepped out onto the balcony, the cool air refreshing after the day's busyness. Her journal lay open on the small table beside her. Picking up her pen, she began to write. Resilience isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It's quiet, steady, and persistent, like a seed growing beneath the soil. And when it finally breaks through, it transforms the landscape. She paused, looking out at the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, each one a reminder of the countless lives moving forward, striving for something better. Melissa continued writing. The world will always have its Eleanor Hastings's people who whisper, "You don't belong." But it also has its Rachels, its Claires, and its unexpected allies. Together, they remind us that belonging isn't just about a seat or a space. It's about the connections we build, the strength we share, and the change we inspire. As she closed her journal, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Jonathan Adler. Adler, just heard from my team, everyone's thrilled with the direction we're taking. Looking forward to seeing this campaign come to life. Melissa smiled, her resolve deepening. The work ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. The days turned into weeks, and Melissa's projects flourished. The Adler campaign launched to widespread acclaim, earning her firm accolades and new opportunities. Her partnership with Claire's company grew stronger, paving the way for future collaborations. Yet it wasn't just the professional victories that stayed with Melissa. It was the moments of connection, the quiet nods of understanding, the words of encouragement, the shared determination to create a world where everyone belonged. One afternoon, Melissa received a letter in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but as she opened it, she recognized the handwriting. It was from Rachel. Dear Melissa, I don't know if you remember me, but we met briefly in New York. I've thought about our conversation many times since then. It gave me the courage to apply for a promotion I didn't think I deserved, and I got it. Thank you for reminding me that I belong and that it's okay to take up space. You changed my life more than you know. Melissa read the letter twice, her chest tightening with emotion. She tucked it into her journal, a keepsake of the ripple effect she had helped create. As the months passed, Melissa continued to grow professionally and personally. She faced new challenges, but the lessons she had learned stayed with her, guiding her through every obstacle. She thought often of her mother's words, "You carry your belonging with you." Now, Melissa understood the full depth of that wisdom. Belonging wasn't just about holding her own, it was about lifting others, about building a world where no one had to question their place. And as she stood on her balcony one evening, the city lights stretching into the horizon, Melissa felt a quiet, unshakable certainty. This was only the beginning. Melissa Carter's journey reminds us that resilience, kindness, and standing firm in the face of challenges can transform not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. Her story teaches us that belonging isn't something given, it's something we carry within ourselves. And by holding on to it, we can inspire change in even the most unlikely places. If Melissa's story moved you, inspired you, or gave you a new perspective, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more stories of perseverance, hope, and the quiet strength that drives us forward. Together, let's continue sharing stories that make a difference. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.